Hello and welcome to a mod spotlight over MechJeb. This is an autopilot mod that can take control of your vessels, fly them around, land them, dock them, and even some basic orbital maneuvers. Now let's first look at a few settings that we can see in the VAB. First off, you can change the skin to see which look you like the best. And there's a couple of options. I'm just going to stick with the standard one. You can also hide brake on eject in the rover controller and hide a menu button. But we're going to set those to default. Now, Delta V stats is very useful for building and designing vessels. It tells you how much Delta V your vessel has currently based on atmosphere and vacuum stats. Now, since I don't have an engine, this is based solely off the MJ monopropellant found in this MechJeb core probe. Now, MechJeb is very sparse on parts. It only adds this pod version that you see I have selected and a small controller. Now, I'm going to put a couple fuel tanks on so we can watch Delta V change. Now, if you look, 651 has appeared next to the 1694. That's how much fuel I have for Delta V. And once I add an engine, you see my Delta V went up significantly from 1694 to 2400. But I want a better engine. And now Delta V in the vacuum has gone up to 3532. So it tells you how much Delta V you have on your vessel, and it's very useful for building it, so you know how much Delta V you need for either getting off the atmosphere or getting to the moon. And even while you're flying, it's highly useful to tell how much you have left for planning maneuver nodes. As you can see, it also organizes everything in stages. So you can see stage 0, I have so much, and in stage 1, I also have some. Currently, the stats are for Kerbal, but as you can see, you can change the planet that you're referencing. Also, vessel info will tell you how much max thrust you have, along with your vessel's mass and the surface thrust to weight ratio. That is of the current planet you're under the influence of. So the 3.01 is based on Kerbal. Now, if you notice custom window editor is up there, we'll get into that later once we have actually seen what some of the different modules MechJeb does. So let's go to Launchpad. So now that we're out on the Launchpad, let's go over the vessel info. Now, this will tell you how much surface to weight ratio or thrust to weight ratio you have, along with your total mass. Most of the modules are labeled really nicely, so it's very easy to tell what kind of information it's giving you. For example, we can see Delta V is very nicely labeled, so we know what everything is happening with it. And we also have another tab, Orbit Info. This one was not in the VAB. That tells us our max height, same with Surface Info. It'll give us some of the same information. Surface Info, however, is really good for landing, and orbital info is really good for launching. It can help you get your orbit without having to constantly switch in and out of map view. And surface info can give you times like how fast you're moving horizontally and vertically, and what your altitude is compared to the ground, because sometimes when you land on mountains, the standard altitude meter isn't exactly accurate. But you can see the surface info also will give your coordinates, which will be very nice in landing our different vessels. But you can see we have all this information from the orbital display as well. Now, there is a nice online manual you can check out. It's a bit outdated, but it will still give you the basics. For this, we're going to look at Ascent Guidance. Now, this is the main function and one of the best in MechJeb. Now, Show Navball Ascent Guidance will create a purple marker. But let's first look at this. You have to give it an orbital altitude. Now, this is in kilometers. As you can see, I put 100,000 in, but that's 100,000 kilometers. I'll show why I did that in a moment. Orbital inclination, I'll set to 45 degrees. Prevent overheats is a utility. It will basically tell the engines to throttle down if they're about to overheat. This way you don't have any engines exploding during launch. You also have a feature auto stage, but let's look limit to terminal velocity. This limits how quickly your ship will accelerate upwards If you've ever watched any other tutorials, this number is basically will limit you to about 200 meters per second until you've broken the atmosphere. It's so that you don't waste fuel accelerating too quickly and fighting the air resistance. Alternatively, you can limit your acceleration to a certain degree in meters per second. And standard it's set to 40, you can set this to 30 if your vessel's large. If you set it any less than 9, your vessel will not be able to take off because the gravity on Kerbal is about 9 meters per second. You can also limit your throttle, which would do the same thing as the thrust limiter when you right click on an engine. We'll show corrective steering in a moment. Auto stage, this tells you how many times you can auto stage. You can stop at stage number you want. 0 means it will auto stage 0 but not go any further, and you can delay it and put a post delay on it. You can also set it to auto warp if you see down there, where the ship will auto warp while it waits to do its next burn. Now, the show nav ball guidance, this gives you a purple marker that will show you how your vessel is going to lift off, and it's going to follow the Ascent flight path, but we'll look at that in a different launch. Let's push engage autopilot. Why didn't it launch? Well, it didn't launch because it will never stage the actual launch stage. It does not auto stage that one, unless you have a target selected, in which case it will do a timed launch and it will stage out this one. However, we'll get it started by pushing spacebar. Now, first thing you can see is it's limiting the acceleration. Now it's limiting terminal velocity. When the checkbox or the dot box turns green, it means that is active or under effect. As you can see, when I deselect them, we'll accelerate rapidly, but when I select them, they turn green and the engine shut off. This is so we don't accelerate too rapidly. Now if you see the Ascent flight path, when we reach 10,000, that purple marker will slowly tilt. But what I'm going to show now is corrective steering. As you can see, I'm tilting away. And the way the autopilot will work is it will still fire straight, and it will readjust my angle so that I follow that purple marker, or the purplish pink marker. And once I'm facing the purplish pink marker, it'll stop adjusting my course. But as you can see, the prograde marker is still a bit to the left. If you use corrective steering, it will change your Ascent flight path to correctively fix it so it's more spot on with the natural form. As you can see, the purple marker shifted, and it's going to shift it to correctively steer out the problem until it's perfectly level again, whereas without corrective steering it won't fix this. Now, I just used it and it kind of moved me into the gravity turn, but I'm sure you can see what it does. Now, with most of these, it really just takes a lot of playing around with it, because for most of the modules, they're limited, or they're labeled so well that it's really easy to tell what each and every one does. But I'm still going to do this as kind of a quick overview. Now we'll speed things along to get this over with. As you can see, it's trying to obey me. If you noticed, it is obeying the 45-degree angle, and it's going to try to get me 100,000 kilometers. However, the reason I picked this one first is because I want to show you it can't do something unreasonable. Now, it cannot get a 100,000 kilometer orbit around Kerbal. So what it's going to do is it's just going to get me an escape where it thinks it would have gotten me a 100,000 kilometer orbit, and then it's just going to basically shut down. It will no longer work because it's not entirely sure what it's doing. Now, you can't give it something unreasonable, but most requests are reasonable and it will work. On the launch pad, I made a quick adjustment to the fuel lines, and this time we're going to edit the ascent path. The red line that you see is basically the angle that we're going to be traveling. As you can see, we make a pretty sharp turn once we hit 6.9 kilometers, but we can change this. For example, turn start altitude is now 24, 14, and we can adjust it. We'll leave it at 15 for now. And we can also change the turn shape. As you can see, the lower the shape, the more sharp of a turn we have once we reach that start turn altitude. And the higher percentage of a shape, the more gradual the turn is. Now, neither of them are the most effective, but you really need to pick which one is best for the vessel. Larger vessels, you probably want a higher percentage turn slope because it's more gradual, whereas with smaller vessels you can probably put it down around 40 to 50%. The final flight path angle is basically, instead of it being perfect 0 degrees, which is exactly facing prograde, it'll have you pointed a little bit out. That will just add eccentricity to your orbit. Now I'm going to fix my staging, and we'll get launching with the same settings for the most part, except this time we're going to use the Edit Ascent Path. We're going to use that marker. Instead of our auto turn starting at 10,000, we'll see that it starts at 15. Now I did change a couple things like the orbital altitude and the stop at stage 2, meaning it will only stage this one stage 3. But I'm actually going to take this moment while we're watching this launch to go over a couple more of the MechJeb modules, basically, that you can look at. Now, the first one is attitude adjustment. This you really have to play with to understand what it does. But basically, this is the SAS. Now, as you look, there's a checkbox, use stock SAS, and TF auto tuning. Now, what this is if you mess with these, it will change the way the SAS works, like how aggressive it is, how precise it is. And you really have to play with it to kind of get a feel for it, but it works just fine standard, so there's no real need to mess around with it, only if you really want to adjust how it works. Now, with this launch, you can see that it's not going to stage its final one. As you can see right here, we have to push spacebar ourselves to stage it. And also, if you look at the autopilot status, it says circularizing. The autopilot will tell you what it's currently doing, which is very helpful to figure out what exactly it's doing if it's not burning engines and you expect it to. So it's really helpful when you're trying to figure out what it does. Now, let's talk about some of the other utilities. As you can see, I have the warp helper open, and this will let you warp to a certain phase angle. It'll let you warp until you reach the periapsis of your current orbit. You can even warp it for a set amount of time. But let's just warp to the periapsis, and as you can see, it'll gradually warp us forward. And then as we approach our periapsis, it will gradually slow down the warp. This can be nice so you don't accidentally miss your next burn. And you can set the warp helper to warp you until the next node, and even give you maybe 15 to 20 seconds of lead time if you need it. Now, as you can see, we slowed down nicely and it got us there. We can also do sphere of influence transition, so you no longer slam into the moon. And there's the set amount of time. So if you want to give it like 1,000-second warp time, then you can. It's not a problem. And it'll warp for 1,000 seconds. There are also several really nice utilities. We've seen limit to terminal velocity, prevent overheats, limit acceleration, limit throttle. Most of them are in the Ascend guidance. However, there's also prevent jet flameout. This will stop the jets from flaming out if they're about to. Smooth throttle will force the throttle to enact slowly, and if you enable it, you can't actually push X to instantly disable throttle. You'll have to wait a couple of seconds for that to happen. Now, I'm actually going to show this one off really quick. And as you can see, the throttle isn't allowed to jump from max to min. This makes it so large craft that you're maybe pushing won't instantly have it jump. And it doesn't affect the autopilot alone, it will also affect your own control. So if you push X, like I said, it will slowly throttle you down. Now, manage air intakes will disable air intakes if you don't need the extra air, and will also enable more as you get higher altitudes and need more. That way you don't have as much drag against your space plane. And lastly, we have seen, the jet safety margin is just the percentage of air intake that you need versus what you have. The higher safety margin, the less chances you have of accidentally flaming out. And we've seen auto stage before. And we've already looked at warp helper. So let's move on. Take a look at the rendezvous planner, and I've sped this up because this took about 15 minutes to do in real time, but basically the rendezvous planner works in stages. Align planes, which is, as you can see what I'm doing now, is it creates a maneuver node for you, and you still have to execute the maneuver node yourself. So, as you can see, I almost miss it, but first off, the first step to a rendezvous is you align planes, and this is really helpful for the new player who is having trouble getting these rendezvous with your stations. Now after you align the planes, you have to establish a new orbit, and you can establish either higher or lower than the orbit of your target. And make sure you do have something targeted when you try to do this. As you can see, my target is 500 kilometers by 500 kilometers for the apoapsis and periapsis. It also gives me my current orbit, the time until our closest approach, and our separation at that approach. Now, I'm establishing a new orbit at 300 kilometers, which is less than my target. And after we establish a new orbit, we use Intercept with a Hoffman transfer. Now, the Hoffman transfer basically is set so you go toward your apoapsis and you just burn until your next periapsis is level with your target. As you can see, we have a node all set for us. Now, I'm going to be lazy and I'm going to use the Smart ASS to point toward the node for me. This way, I just have to control the throttle and not so much the steering. Now, the Smart ASS, while I have it open, is basically just a pointer. It'll point you towards whatever you need, whatever direction, and just play around with it to get a feel for what each one does, but you can have it point to your nodes, which makes it much easier. Now, as you can see, our current orbit is going to do the intercept. So we've completed the third stage of a rendezvous, the intercept with the Hoffman transfer. Now, the next step is to match our velocities at the closest approach, and when we push the button, it'll be nice and create a node for us. And as you can see, that once we reach our node, we'll just match our velocity, which will basically aligns our semi-major axis, which makes it so we go at the same pace. Now we push get closer. What this does is it creates a node pointing directly toward whatever you're trying to burn towards, and you can just burn toward it. In which case your relative velocity will be moving towards it, and once you're close enough, all you have to do is match your velocity at the closest approach yet again, and then get closer, match your velocity at the closest approach, get closer, and repeat this process continually until, of course, you're close enough. Now, because I turn really slow, I'm going to ditch my engines and just use RCS from here on out. Now you can see my closest approach is really going down, which is nice. And you can see even if you do use RCS, it will still create the nodes for you. So they're very helpful. Like I said, I am cheating a little bit using the Smart ASS, which is going to point me toward my target. But that is the basics of the rendezvous planner, making it very easy to get the rendezvous for the new player. MechJeb also offers an autopilot docking. Now, basically, you select the docking port you want to dock with and the docking port you want to control from. And make sure those are selected because these are the ones it's going to dock together. And you just put engage autopilot and it will tell you what it's doing, like moving toward the docking node. It gives you tons of information based on your translation compared to the other docking node, and then it will dock you, nice and easy. It's gotten a lot more efficient since the earlier versions of the plugin. Now, I want to show you another vessel because I do have to dock another one to my space station. However, this time I'm going to use the Rendezvous Autopilot. This is the same thing as the Rendezvous Planner, except it does everything for you. And it will tell you what it's doing. For example, matching planes, which was the first thing we needed to do with the autopilot. Now, it's going to plan the Hoffman transfer, just like we did, except with the autopilot, it not only creates the node, it will also execute the node for you. And this is really good for anyone who plays this game, because it's not the most efficient way to do things, but it gives you an idea on what you need to do to get these encounters. And it's really helpful because you can learn how the autopilot does it to learn how to do it yourself and then improve upon it, which is very helpful for new and experienced players. And as you can see, it's going to get close to the target, and then it's going to match velocities at the closest approach, just like we did. except this time we can just walk away and get a cup of coffee or something. Now, I'm just going to let it finish off. Getting the Intercept so that you guys can see I'm not lying, and indeed it does do everything for us. And once we've reached our 100 meters, which is what we told it, it stops. Back on the launch pad, there's one more method of launching, and this is the launch to rendezvous. As you can see, we have it set, and if we launch to rendezvous, it'll auto warp until the launching time window, in which case it will do a quick countdown of 8 seconds or whatever you set it to, and automatically launch your vessel. And it will stage this time. Now you can see we're just abiding by our limit to terminal velocity, and again that's entirely optional. It's just typically more fuel efficient to use it, but it depends on the vessel. And in order to do the launch at rendezvous, you must have a vessel selected before you launch your craft, the vessel you want to rendezvous. Because once you have your target, the option will open up, and the autopilot will tell you what it's up to. And as you can see, just continuing our staging, and it'll align the plane mostly, and then circularize into the actual rendezvous, as you can see now. Finishing our last burn, in which case it's very easy to get an intercept. You can just use our rendezvous autopilot to actually get our finished intercept. Simple as that. Now, MechJeb has got one more trick up its launching sleeve, and this is if you actually target something like the moon, or you can also target min-miss, and what it will do is, when you push launch to intercept, it will launch and intercept you to the moon or min-miss. Now this only works for planets in Kerbin's sphere of influence. Otherwise the autopilot gets a little mistaken that you're launching something that exits Kerbin's sphere of influence, and ultimately will not work. But this makes an easy trip to the moon and to min-miss. However, I do have to warn you that it assumes you want to get directly on top of the moon or min-miss, meaning it will give you a crash course to the moon. So it's not necessarily the safest method or the most fuel efficient, but it's definitely pretty easy if you're packing way more delta V than you need. Now you can see here I'm using the orbit info to manually control this craft, mostly because I don't trust the autopilot to angle it the way I need it to, because I don't have enough fuel in my initial stages with tons of thrust. Most of my fuel is in this transfer stage with all of my nuclear engines. So I'm actually doing this bit manually. Now, the mention of that, the reason I'm doing it manually, is the autopilot does assume perfect conditions. For this, it would not accommodate for the fact that I have low thrust and that by the time I met my apoapsis, I'd already be falling back down. It wouldn't pitch my nose away from the planet to give myself a little more height. The autopilot isn't perfect or the most fuel efficient, but it does get the job done. So if you're using ion engines and you have a 30-minute burn, just tell the autopilot to do it and you can walk away and watch your favorite TV show. Or maybe watch a few YouTube videos. Who knows? It's very helpful. But what I'm doing now is I'm actually going to use the rendezvous planner and the maneuver node editor. Mostly takes playing around to learn how to use it, but the maneuver node editor has a nice button called execute next node, so it will also tell it to auto warp, and the tolerance is how tolerant it is of getting exactly on, meaning 0.1 meters per second it will burn to the nearest 0.1 meters per second. Also, you can change the prograde meters per second velocity along with the radial and nominal. Now, Maneuver Planner will let us do the same thing. We can create nodes, we can create and execute or remove all nodes, and we can say Hoffman transfer to target, and we can just push create and execute and it will transfer us to the moon. It's also got tons of other options that you can check out. Each one is labeled appropriately and should be easy to figure out its purpose. For now, we're going to use the Hoffman transfer and we're going to tell it to execute it for us because, we have an autopilot. Why do we need to do things manually? And as you can see, it starts burning, and like I said before, The autopilot it assumes you want to touch the target by the end of the burn, meaning it will give you crash courses. And you'll see this in a minute as we get our encounter. It'll continue burning until it has the closest encounter to the center of mass. As you can see, we have an encounter, but it keeps going until, of course, we have a crash course. Now let's just zoom ahead because we do need to get this rover to the moon to show off some of the rover skills, but we have a crash course. And we don't really want to hit the moon that hard, so we're just going to burn parallel to our prograde marker, or perpendicular to our prograde marker, sorry, and just readjust our orbit, making it so, well, we don't hit the moon so violently that our rover does not remain intact. So just a quick burn, and we'll actually use the maneuver planner again. We'll tell it to circularize. Now, we don't want to circularize this far out, so we'll get until our periapsis and then tell it to. And push create and execute, and once we get rotated right, we will indeed circularize our burn. And MechJeb has a lot of options that you can do, and it can basically get your ship from any one point to another without you having to take any manual control. Now, we're going to look at one of my favorite, is the landing autopilot. Landing is one of the hardest things to do for a new player, and sometimes even an experienced player. But MechJeb has a landing guidance, and this will let you import your target coordinates, or pick a target directly. Now we're going to pick a spot that looks flat. So right there is pretty good. And you just left click and it will set that target. Then you can tell it to land at target, in which case MechJeb will do its best to land you exactly on the target location. Now I'm just going to ditch that stage because I know I'm going to, and get away from it so we don't hit it later. Now you can also tell it touchdown speed. You can tell it if you want it to deploy landing gear, auto warp, use parachutes, show landing predictions, or show aero brake nodes. Everything, like I said, MechJeb is very nicely labeled, so it's very easy to figure out what each button does. Although some of them are still a little bit confusing. However, we're just going to watch the autolander do its thing. Now, the landing guidance is not perfect unless you have an orbit of 100,000 meters or more. And the reason for this is it can't necessarily predict. At first it looks like I'm not going to get this, but like I said, the code has been improved since earlier versions of Kerbal Space Program, and it works a lot more accurately. And we do manage to get spot on. However, it's not guaranteed unless you're 100,000 meters or more above in an orbit. Anything lower, it can't necessarily guarantee that you're going to slow down fast enough. Also, the landing autopilot is not the most efficient. The most efficient way to land is to get as low as you can to the planet and then burn off all your horizontal velocity while not getting too much vertical. MechJeb doesn't care. It just gets you on the ground. It doesn't care how efficient it is or how inefficient it is. But it does do the job, so I guess it's a win. As you can see, we have indeed touched down safely. And now that we're here, we're just going to take a quick save, and I'm going to show you the Translatortron. And this basically lets you keep your velocity standard, like keep vertical speed to 1 meter per second. Keep surface speed. Now, keep surface will just keep you level with the surface on where you are. As you can see, this is very helpful for rotating or for kind of halfway landing manually, but mostly for levitating. It's where it's true purpose science. And keep surface, as you can see, will keep you level with the surface without changing your velocity. Keep object will keep your velocity the same with the object you have selected. And the panic button is dangerous. It will basically fire the engines full throttle in hopes of doing something like if you're about to crash. However, if you're not about to crash, it will probably crash you. So we're going to pull our rover off here, and we're going to try out the Rover Autopilot now. So, see you in a bit. Okay, so we have got our rover here, and we're going to be testing out the Rover Autopilot. Now, as you can see, we have heading control and speed control. These are the two main things. Now, heading control will pick the degree marker on your nav ball and head in that direction. Now if we set it to 90, it will want to head in the 90-degree direction. And this will not control the speed, meaning we still have to use our throttle up and throttle down keys, or our move forward and backwards for the rover, in order to move it. Now if you use speed control, however, you can set a constant speed you want the rover to move with. And if we set it to 5, then the speed control will do its best to keep us at 5 meters per second. However, it typically won't brake to slow down, but as you can see, once we reach about 5, it'll try to keep it there. Unless it's going uphill or downhill, then of course it will shift its speed. And it'll give you the speed error to see how spot on it is. Now, you also see a couple other things: stability control, brake on pilot eject, and brake on energy depletion. If you run out of energy, it'll tell your vessel to brake so that you can wait until day. And it even has an option. It says auto warp until day. So it adds a lot of versatility with controlling your rovers if you find it boring to go on long expeditions. Stability control, basically what it attempts to do, and I'm not 100% sure on this, but it tries to keep your rover from flipping by slowing down for turns. If it's shaking a lot around the nav ball, then it will try to slow down. It'll also apply torque, and if you have RCS enabled, try to use that. It basically tries to keep your craft stable. Like I said, a lot of these are self-explanatory. Brake on pilot eject: if the pilot falls out, brake the rover so it doesn't just continue rolling away forever. And brake on energy depletion lets you warp until day if the energy is still depleted. Now, target speed, this allows you to select a target, and you can actually push follow to follow the target, meaning you will drive toward it. Now, I'm just going to brake really fast to show you waypoints. These are where the Rover Autopilot is really powerful. Now that we're braked, we're going to go on the map and select our target. Now, you can push to target, in which case you will immediately just drive straight to the target. You can also add another target, or you can use waypoints. Now, waypoints seem confusing at first, but they're really quite easy. Basically, a waypoint is a target on the surface of the planet you're on, or moon in this case, and you have a few settings like how large is the target, how fast should you travel when you get to it, and the latitude and longitude. Now, there's also a really helpful guide here that will tell you in-depth detail of everything you need to know. So I'm not going to read everything. You can read that yourself if you're still confused on waypoints, but basically how you use waypoints is you add them, you pick a target on the map, and you organize them so that you follow them. This way you can avoid craters and other obstacles along the planet. For example, let's add a waypoint. Now, it gives us this landing marker again, but we'll click right there. Now we have a waypoint to that location, and we'll add another one. Of course, we're adding these to try and avoid all of these craters. That way our rover doesn't fall over and get stuck. But they're out of order. Well, you just have to select them and push up or down, in which case you can reorganize the order of your waypoints until they're ordered in the proper format so that you can avoid all of the dangerous craters. And what will happen is the rover will drive to the first waypoint. Once it's accomplished that, the waypoint will delete itself, and your rover will try to drive to the next waypoint. This way you can create a complicated chain of networks that you need your rover to do so that you don't have to do it yourself, and you can avoid the dangerous obstacles like mountains or craters. And you can add a limitless number of these waypoints, and it will give you a total distance of the waypoints and the estimated time it will take to drive across all of them, as seen in the top of this box. And of course, like I said, you have to try this out to really understand how it works, play around with it, see how some of the autopilot works. Definitely read that tutorial, it's very informative. Now, there's also a few other miscellaneous settings in the Rover Autopilot that you can play around with, but for now, it's pretty safe to say just to keep them normal. Now, let's look at spaceplane guidance. So, you can see that we're actually at the island runway right now. This was me just testing out the spaceplane guidance, and it works really well, to be honest. This is just the standard stock jet. I'm not sure on the model, but one of the stock jets, and I just attached the MechJeb module to it so we can use it. Now we're going to set the landing of the spaceplane guidance to the Kerbal Space Center runway. And throttle up, turn off our brakes, and we'll take off. And of course I won't make you watch it in real time because this is what video editing is for, speeding stuff up. Now, what you can do is the heading, again, is a nav ball number. You can choose your heading, you can choose whether or not to hold the heading, and you can also set the altitude in which you want to travel at. And of course you have abort, which will allow you to disable the autopilot. Also, the auto land glide slope will tell you how slowly or quickly you can glide. If that's set to 90 degrees, you can literally dive into an auto land, but I do not recommend it because I haven't tested it, but I'm not sure how the autopilot would actually handle it. Now, I'm going to give it a little bit of help by aligning this landing pretty well before I push auto land. And auto land is currently set, and I'm a little skeptical. The engines aren't shutting off yet, so I don't think it's actually going to land. And my fears come true when it goes way too fast. I can't exactly say it's reliable, but I did manage to get it work on the second pass. Well, actually, I kind of lied there. On the second pass, I landed myself because I stopped trusting the autopilot. Even when I landed on the runway, I landed myself because I didn't quite trust it. So, the autopilot autoland I can't say it's reliable, at least in my experiences of testing it, but it can work and it can give you a general idea on how to do stuff. Anyhow, MechJeb is great for anyone who plays Kerbal Space Program because it can help you learn how to do things like rendezvous and dockings because it gives you all the information you need to know. It can also do it for you if you're not quite sure how or you're having trouble doing it yourself. Definitely it's one of the best mods out there just for how much it has in it. For a simple part that weighs almost nothing, you can attach to any vessel, and it does so much. So, I thank you all for watching this video, this mod spotlight over MechJeb, and I hope to see you guys again. Okay, so I managed to forget one. I promised to show off the custom window editor, and I never did get around to it, so we're going to do that quickly now. Now, the custom window editor allows you to first edit any of the windows that already exist, and you can click on them, add or remove these various components like the altitude meter, what your pitch is, your roll, your speed across the surface, vertical speed, and you can change these for any ones, but we want to create a new one. So when you create a new window, you're going to get this blank window here that's just going to say add items to this window, and we can name it whatever we want. So we're going to call it our custom window, and you can see updates in real time over here, and it adds it so that we can check it and uncheck it over in our tab bar. Now, what do we want this window to do? Well, down here on the bottom of the custom window editor, we see this orbit, and we can add whatever we want from the orbit. Let's add our apoapsis. What else do we have? Our orbital period and our periapsis. And we also want something from surface. How about our surface speed? And you have all these different tabs that you can cycle through that just give you the general kind of thought on where this is. Ooh, part count will be helpful. Don't need anything from target, recorder, and thrust. You have all these different tabs. You can see what each one is. They're nice and labeled to tell you what they do. Traction brake limit. And there's a lot of interesting ones that you don't see in the normal tabs that are already pre-created. Now, you see I now have my window with all of this information that I want, but I don't feel as though surface speed is really necessary anymore. So, if we go to the top of this, then we can select surface speed and we can remove it entirely. But now I want my orbital period to be below periapsis, so click on that and we can move down a couple times, and we set it where we need it to be. And alternatively, you can move things up and arrange them. You can also hide this editor. As you see, when we're in flight, we have more modules. Well, that's because they're hidden in the editor, and now we can't tab it. However, if we push it, we'll see it again, and if we uncheck flight, then we won't be able to see it when we launch our craft. This is the basics of the window editor. You really have to play around with some of all of these to really see what they do, but it's a huge amount, it's a much larger pool of information than we see from the regular windows. And this wasn't the only one I managed to forget, so I'm going to show off the RCS balancer. So I managed to forget another one, and this is the RCS balancer module. As you can see, when you check Smart Translation, you get this. Now, what Overdrive does, it allows the RCS thruster blocks to reduce their ISP efficiency but get more power. That way, you don't have things like this when they begin to rotate when you try to translate. For example, let me show that off. Also, the RCS balancer does something weird with the MJ propellant, so that's what that really large animation you're seeing is. But if you see, I'm just going to try to translate. It's all I'm doing one direction, and it's rotating. Well, I don't want that to happen. So if I steady my vessel and I click Smart Translation, it can overdrive each of these thruster blocks so that they try to keep this balance better. So as you can see, now I'm no longer rotating. And the only reason I'm rotating the opposite direction is because I had leftover momentum heading that way. As you can see, I'm no longer rotating, and I am able to translate. Because these thruster blocks up here are being overdriven up to 100%. Now I can limit this, in which case we will begin to rotate again, because they aren't able to supply enough power, as you can see. But the efficiency goes down when they do this. Now, it won't tell you necessarily that it's going down, but it does use a lot more monopropellant to use the overdrive.